Welcome to Mediators Mathematicians class. Today I'm going to be going through a grade 8 winter holiday class. This is based on term 1, term two's work. So what I'll be doing today is just doing a revision of the topics that you guys did. We will discuss some of them are not so important, some of them are way important than others. So I'll be just giving you guys the key highlights to watch to look for in terms of your revision. Mind you, if you're a grade 8 student, it doesn't mean that the topics in term 1 and term 2 won't be covered, but instead, what will happen is because of progressive learning, you will then learn it again in grade 9, and then it might come out as a more advanced type of question, right? So, with that said, I myself is Mr. Sokela. I am a tutor with Mediators. I'm normally focused on grade 8, 9, 10, and 11 mathematics in South Africa using the South African CAPS standard. However, for some of you guys that are maybe doing A levels with the UK and other type of standards, you guys are more than welcome to watch my YouTube videos. But if you find them a little bit not interesting, you're also welcome to take your pick, right? So there are a bunch of maths tutors and maths educators online. This is just mostly focused on the South African standard. Okay, so let's just move on to our main topic of discussion of today. Today we'll be looking at a few lesson objectives that we're going to be covered. The first one is the main topics for grade 8, term 1. So the first topic is then your whole numbers, and then moving on from whole numbers, you then have your integers. Let me just bring up the page there. So where's my integer page? What's happening? Okay, there's my page 2. So you then have whole numbers, integers, and then comes your common fractions, then your decimal fractions and percentages. This is just a rough idea or a rough sketch to what you guys are going to be going through in terms of term 1. I'll be doing the same thing with term two's video, which I'll then go just start with the topics first, do a little bit of explanatory statements, and then I'm going to go into the good stuff, right? So let's just go to the first page here. So with whole numbers, integers, decimal, and so forth, you just need to also just have an understanding of your number system, right? So your number system plays a huge role in your ability to actually understand all these key topics here. If you do not grasp your number system, it means that you need to thoroughly go through it before you can then tackle these type of questions, right? So, firstly, I'll be talking about whole numbers, but the first topic that I'm going to be looking at is just your order of operation. So here I've got a small short sentence here. What does it say? It says, so Batman does additional skirts. What does that mean? Here, what I'm going to do is simply just take the first letters of the the statement here. So the first one is an S, then comes a B, then you have an M, and then you have a D, and then you have an A, and then you have an S. So these are the few statements that we're going to be looking at. Okay, so as I was saying, you then have, so Batman does additional skirts. So here I'm just doing a funny little statement so that you can remember your operations. Starting with the S there. When we look at S, I want you guys to think about all your surds, right? And then when you look at B, I want you guys to think about brackets. And then when you look at your M, I want you guys to think about multiplication. And then when you look at your D, I want you guys to think about division. And then for your A, I've made you guys to think about addition. And then finally, when you look at your S, I need you guys to think about your subtraction, right? So let's just quickly go through each and every topic there or main point. So for our surds, what I want you guys to think about, whenever you have a question or any type of sum, you need to always look at the surds first. When I'm looking at surds, what am I thinking about? I'm looking at any power, right? So whether I have a power or any root, powers and roots. So that's where you're going to start. So this is just giving you guys, we can just say this is your steps. We can say these are the what? The steps to answering any sum, right? So you have a particular sum that you're doing or dealing with. They say without a calculator, find the value of, or they just simply say find the value of. That means you then have to take the necessary steps to ensure that you do each and every step appropriately. Meaning you'll start off with your surds, then move on to what? To brackets. Brackets being what? I need to say open parentheses, close parentheses. We use brackets, we call these brackets, but some people call these brackets, meaning what we say normally in classes in South Africa, we just say these are square brackets and then these ones here and then your actual brackets. But with this, it's mostly then your parentheses, so open parentheses, and then on this side here, these are then your actual brackets, right? So this, I'll just give you guys a heads up. This is when you look at brackets, we're normally looking at distributing, right? Normally, when it comes to actual sums, we normally look at distributing, meaning we can give each of the terms whatever term they have in front, right? Meaning here, I'll just put an A, B plus C, meaning you're giving or you're distributing A to B and saying this is then AB plus AC, right? So that's where your brackets actually play a huge role in most of the cases. So we can even say that this is like 80, let's make it 85% of the time you will be applying that rule there. And then moving on, we then have multiplication. With multiplication, we can just simply look at multiplication as just a standard operation, meaning what this is telling you is that in order for you to actually go on to multiplication, you need to start off by doing your brackets first. Meaning if you haven't done your brackets or you haven't done your sets, that means you cannot then go on to multiplication, right? And then afterwards, you then have division. I did this on purpose to start with multiplication, then division. Why do I do this? Because I'll be applying the same rule when it comes to your exponents, right? So exponential laws, or we call them index laws, right? So when it comes to your index laws or exponential laws, this format is way better in explaining each and every aspect of it, right? And then moving on, we then have addition. Addition is just your just standard addition and subtraction sums, right? There's nothing to it. You're just saying 5 plus 1 is 6, or 5 minus 7 is -2. So also there, I can just emphasize that you can then go on and think about mostly your integers, especially with the subtraction part, right? So subtraction then gives out some sort of integer that you might be dealing with, right? So let's move on to the next part. So here I just wanted to talk about order of operation first because I find it as a very key topic to actually bring about your understanding, right, of the rest of the topics. Because immediately, if you don't understand your number system and then you don't understand your order of operations, then everything just falls apart afterwards, right? So moving on, you then have some properties of whole numbers. With this, WN stands for whole numbers. Just please remember that. I might illustrated as such in the upcoming videos. So please look out for that. So The first properties we have, or just the first bullets, is then commutative property of addition and multiplication. And when we say we're communicating or commutative, that means that numbers have some sort of relationship between them that we can look at, right? And then we also have associative property of addition and multiplication. Here, mostly it has to do with your brackets, right? Associative is mostly how we group things, how we associate them together, right? So it's more of grouping instead of commutative. When you think about commutative, is how numbers respond to each other. We can say commutative, how they respond to each other. So respond, okay, respond to each other. And then when we're looking associative is how they're grouped together. So we're looking at more of some sort of grouping that is involved. And then we got distributive property. When you think about distributive property, is the property that I was talking about here, right? Distributive, it's mostly to do with your brackets, right? How we give A to B as well as to C, right? As you guys can see, we're giving that A there to the B there, and we're also giving the same A to who? To the C. So that then creates the next line there as A multiplied by B plus A multiplied by C. Okay, then we're moving on. We then have mental arithmetic sums. When I talk about mental arithmetic sums, right, it's just telling you that you should be able to do arithmetic sums in your head, right? Meaning you should be able to apply all the properties that you have learned here and onwards in your head, meaning there is no need for a calculator when it comes to these type of stuff. When you're using a calculator, it's actually you hindering yourself or you making yourself a little bit slower than the rest, right? If you feel as though that you're not understanding the properties, you just that means you haven't actually taken the time to go through them in greater detail. It doesn't mean that you're less understanding of such, but it's more of to do with how much time you're actually putting into that specific topic. For example, if you don't understand distributive property, that means you haven't done, let's say, more than 200 questions based on that. And if I'm saying 200 questions, think about it, guys. You can do roughly 5,000 questions a day if you could just do maths only. So it's really how up to you and how you actually distribute your time in this case. Okay, and then moving on, we then have multiples and factors. Multiples and factors, I normally tell my kids that you can just simply use a calculator. It sounds counter intuitive to say that because I just simply said don't use your calculator, but now I'm saying use your calculator. Listen, there are certain topics that are better, you're better off just using a calculator because your calculator is so efficient in, as opposed to um, questions that where you are more efficient. Your calculator is not really efficient at mental arithmetic sums because they cannot quickly apply BODMAS like how you could quickly apply BODMAS. Um, I'll make an example in the next section where I actually include sums here, right? Okay, so moving on, we then have your multiples. Multiples are just based on multiplication. Then we got factors. Factors are based on division. And then we got prime numbers. Prime numbers are mostly based on factors. So if I say it's a prime number, it means it only has two factors, one in itself. So for example, if I look at 2, 2 is the prime number. Why? Because it can only be divisible by 2. So I can say 2 divided by 2 and get 1, right? And it's only divisible by 1. So 2 divided by 1 is equal to 2. And that's the only two answers I can get without leaving a remainder. So meaning that those are then a prime number, right? So 2 is then a prime number because it only has two factors. And then moving on, we then have prime factors. With prime factors, what I want you guys to think about is that prime factors are factors of a number that are just written in prime, meaning they are factors, right, of a number that are prime numbers, right? Meaning here, if I were to look at 9, right, what will I do in order to write um, 9 as a prime, as a product of its prime factors? I would simply say, what are the factors of 9? Factors of 9 is 1, right? And then what else do I have? I've got 1. Can I divide by 2? No. I normally go for factor pairs when it comes to this. I normally say, let's deal with factor pairs first with my students. So we say 9. The first one is 1 and 9 because I can simply say, um, we just cancel that. Let's move it to the side. Let's bring this guy back. So I can say 9 divided by 1, which gives me 9. Move on, say divide by 2. Try that. Doesn't work out. Divide by 3. And then guess what I get? I get 3. So then my next factors are then 3 and 3, right? So these are all what? This is what I then call all my factors, right? You can see that here I've got a double factor because 3, 3, and actually 9 is a perfect square. That's why I then have the 3, 3 there, right? So in this case, my factors are 1, 3, 3, and 9. But which one of them are then prime? The only ones that are prime is in what? The 3 and the 3, right? And mind you, when I said as a product of its prime factors, that means 3 times 3. What will 3 times 3 give you? It will give you exactly 9, right? 3 times 3 gives you 9. And then moving on, we then have composite numbers. When I look at composite numbers, I'm looking at um, numbers with 3 or more factors, right? 3 or more factors, right? If it has less, then it's not a composite number, right? And then let's move on to the next topics. Let me just quickly just power through these because they will take much of my time. And I will be doing question by question with these. And then still with natural numbers, sorry, whole numbers, we then have to look at highest common factor, lowest common multiple, right? So those are the two main topics: highest common factor, lowest common multiple. And then here there's a few methods that we make use of. The first one is the leather method, where you then have to write your leather and then put numbers and start dividing by the lowest prime number and go on. And then here we then have numbers as a product of their prime factors. That's what I then call pop F. So the part that I was doing here, so this is written as a product of its prime factors. And then we also have finding HCF using factors versus using the product of your prime factors. Meaning here, this is mostly a compare type of question, right? I am doing some of these now before you get to grade 9, but you understand that if you know better, then you end up doing better. So that's why I'm just including it now so that it doesn't come as a shock next year. And then we also have your LCM, lowest common multiplier, you're using factors as well as using your POPy F or your POP F. So we're going to be doing a bunch of that comparison there. And then we've got ratios and rates. I cannot emphasize the importance of ratios and rates. For some educators, I don't know. It just seems like ratios and rates are not that interesting. But half of the stuff that we have in maths is just based on proportions. Like most of it is just us associating or distributing some sort of portion to something. For example, if I look at financial maths, when I think about profit, profit is a percentage of something. meaning that means it's what? It's a proportion of something. If I look at discount, discount is also what? A proportion of something. If I look at VAT, it's also what? An increase, right, of some sort of number. If I look at budgeting, with financial maths, budgeting is then what? It's allocating funds to certain accounts, meaning, for example, whether I'm going to do some sort of simple interest or whether am I going to do some sort of compound interest will then be dependent on what my budget is, or whether or not I'm going to buy something on high purchase or I'm going to buy it overseas using exchange rates. So I find that most educators they don't really go through ratios and rates that much. Even when I was in high school, I remember just gliding through ratios and rates, but I would put like 5 weeks on it. Like I swear, like ratios and rates are very important. They're even important when it comes to your algebra, right? So meaning if you can think about your algebra and think about it in terms of ratios and rates, it becomes way easier as opposed to just looking at it in terms of fractions. So we got simplifying, and with ratios and rates, we're going to be doing the highest common factor method, right? As well as just using your fractions. Why do I say using fractions? We're going to be using our calculator where we can just input like a simple fraction. Like for example, let's say we wanted to simplify the ratio of 5 is to 10. We just say 5 divided by 10, and that will then give us the fraction form of 1 over 2, which can then be written as what? 1 is to 2, right? Which represents the same amount as 5 is to 10. But mind you that the fraction form is only going to be used when we got two terms, right? Meaning one term compared to the other. If we've got three or more, then we have to go back to the highest common factor method. And then we've got increase and decrease with ratios. That's just us making values a bit higher or a bit lower, right? It's really optional in this case. For example, um, it's more based on if I want to make something bigger or smaller, right? There's nothing to it. I can't actually explain further than that. It's just that. And then you got distributive and proportions. When you distribute things, as I mentioned before, you're just allocating a certain portion to that person and that person. If you go back and think about the days when you guys used to be sent to the shop, what used to happen? They used to tell you that, let's say, boy, girl, go to the shop, then your granny gives you some sort of amount of money. They will say, you take half of the money. What does that mean? It means that you guys should allocate 50-50 of the money, like 50% to 50%, meaning you guys go half half. That is part of what? That is part of distributing, right? You're distributing things equally. And you guys, if you guys are distributing things equally, most of the time, if there's just two people, you just say each one is allocated a half, right? So if it was 100 rand that was given by the granny, we would say 100 rand times a half, and that would then be 50 rand, right? And then you have distributed correctly. And then moving on, we got profit and loss. Profit or loss is based on our financial maths calculations. For all of these, I just want to emphasize that if you do not know your formulas, right? If you do not know your formulae, right, it will be a huge issue because that means you are not learning to remember things and you're just cruising through whatever you're doing. So please do learn your formulas, right? Formulas are very important with financial maths. And then the last three topics, these are main topics, uh, are your integers, integers being based on your number line, right? So here, what I'm going to be thinking about is negatives to zero as well as all your positives. So we're looking at all the negatives as well as your positives, right? That's your number line. And then we got common fractions. Common fractions, I say that they are rational numbers. Why am I saying that common fractions are rational numbers? Because you got two types of, of, of common fractions. The one is a proper proper, and then the other one is an improper. So between these, they just dependent on what? They dependent on whether your denominator is larger than your numerator is larger than your denominator, or the other way around. So here, if I've got small, let's just cancel that, minimize. If I've got small over big, then I've got a proper, right? A proper fraction. In this case, I'll just make a quick example of 2 over 5. So I've got small over big. And then here we've got big over small. An example will then be 5, let's say over 3, to make it a bit different. So here, why am I saying they're rational? Because these are all written as what? They're all written as A over B, where B, that's the first I've ever used. So they're written as A over B, where B is not equal to 0. Because if B is equal to 0, what happens to this equation? It becomes a non-real answer, right? And then finally, we then have our decimal fractions and percentages. Just put that decimal fractions and percentages are a different form of rational numbers, right? Meaning, I'll give you guys these and then ask you, if I were to ask you to write 2 over 5 as a fraction, what would you, or decimal fraction, what would you say? You just simply say 2 divided by 5 and then say SD. So meaning your set your decimal form. So this would then be 0, 4, right? However, if I wanted you to write it as a percentage, all I then have to tell you is then multiply that by 100 and put the percentage sign in front of it, or after it. So you then have 40%. So I'm not going to say much about these because I will be taking out individual videos on these 3 topics here, right? So integers, common fractions, decimal fractions, and percentages will be done on their own. However, in the next video, I will be then diving into each and every topic that was listed for whole numbers, meaning I'll then be starting with the number system. I'll start with the number system. Then I'll then go on to explaining whole numbers again in greater detail, and then go on to explain the commutative property, associative property, distributive property, and then I will do some mental arithmetic sums together, do a little bit of multiples and factors, explain those in greater detail, do some of your uh, highest common factors and your lowest common multiples, and then go for your ratios and rates, and then finally do some financial maths, right? So that's what we're going to be going through in the next video. I hope it's not as long as this one. I hope that I can do it as perfectly as I can. So just please try your best to enjoy these videos. Take your time with your maths, guys. Learn what I'm talking about. Try to do some sort of research. You guys have access to YouTube, you have access to every type of social media that is out there, as well as Google and your chat GBTs. So, yeah, that's it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoy. Have a great one. I will see you guys in the next video. Cheers.